Happy January, everybody. Back here for another edition of Cowboys Overtime here on StarTelegram.com. I am Fort Worth Star-Telegram columnist Mac Engel, and that great-looking gentleman on the other side of your screen is Cowboys beat writer, know-it-all NFL man, and expert of all things NFL draft, Mr. Nick Harris. Nick has been out of town. He was in beautiful Mobile, Alabama, otherwise known as the spring break capital of the world, the last week for the NFL's Senior Bowl. But he's back in town for a very short stay before he goes to New Orleans for the Super Bowl, where, of course, the Dallas Cowboys aren't playing. Nick, scale of 1 to 10. As a spring break destination, how do you rank Mobile, Alabama?
Well, I've never been for spring break specifically, but if I'm gauging what they have, available, honestly, I'd give it like a 6. I feel like there's better destinations because you got Pensacola down the way, you got Panama City down the way, Destin. I feel like you could travel into Florida about 30, 45 minutes and find some better spots. But seafood, phenomenal. The city, phenomenal. It's a nice little town. Reminds me of Waco in a lot of ways.
Did you get to walk down the part of Mobile? I'm being serious about this part. Did you get to walk down the part of Mobile that has a French Quarter feel to it?
Yes, absolutely.
Isn't that kind of neat?
It is, very much so. Very much so.
All right. Well, it's good we were able to talk a little bit of tourism here on Cowboys Overtime. We need to do that more. Want to give a shout out to our friends at Window Nation for sponsoring this and every other episode of Cowboys Overtime. And the first item right off the bat, because we have not had an episode since the announcement was made, the Dallas Cowboys have a new head coach. Jerry Jones has a new pet. Brian Schottenheimer, the new head coach of the Cowboys. A move that Jerry Jones says is the biggest risk he can ever recall taking, to which I call BS. Nick, this one bothers me. Brian Schottenheimer, do you think he's a giant risk, or do you think this is basically a comfortable throw pillow for Jerry Jones?
I do think it's both. I think it was something that Jerry Jones knew a lot about, and it was something that he had, high knowledge in. Instead of going out and bringing in somebody who he doesn't know, he made the comfortable choice in bringing in someone that he does know. Now, the risk involved with it, first-time head coach, his experience as an offensive play caller has not necessarily been Super Bowl caliber. He's never even sniffed a Super Bowl appearance. I think that's where the risk comes into play. And you're also banking the investments that you have on the offensive side of the ball on this first-time head coach. You got Dak Prescott, who's the highest paid player in the NFL by average annual value. You got CeeDee Lamb, second highest paid receiver in the NFL. You're eventually going to have to pay Tyler Smith before Brian Schottenheimer's contract is up. Jake Ferguson's coming up. So you have a lot on the offensive side of the ball that you're putting a lot of money into. So it is a risk bringing in a first-time head coach. I think it's somewhere in between risky and comfortable.
Okay. You and I talked about this a lot, and I think 2 weeks ago, you nor I really thought this was going to happen. Just for all the reasons kind of you mentioned, which was he hasn't really sniffed a Super Bowl. He did have the tag of the hot assistant, which, if you're a coordinator on a good team, you'll get that tag as an offensive guy, never as a defensive guy. And that came and went, as it does happen for assistants. Obviously his lineage with his father is as good as could be to this kind of job. Tell me some other reasons why you think this is a good hire for Jerry Jones as the head coach of the Cowboys.
Yeah, I think if they're trying to emphasize culture within that building, then this certainly does that. I mean, we knew it was going to be a guy that was going to win the press conference on Monday, and I think he certainly did. He's going to be the guy that's kind of rah-rah in your face a little bit, and he's done that not only in practice availabilities that we've seen or training camp availabilities that we've seen, but even in pressers. I mean, he's very thorough. He's a people person. He said that many times during the presser. I think that's going to resonate with the locker room and the current generation of players that are in that locker room. Now, granted, where does your discipline come into play in the same token? I still think he has some of those knacks. I think when it comes to managing the people in an NFL locker room, I think it's a great hire. But as far as on-field presence and what he can do schematically and offensive scheme and play calling, that's where all the questions are going to come into play. But I think as soon as you step off the field and step away from the cameras, this is a great hire. But it all matters on what happens on camera and on primetime television.
He did mention that you just said it, and he mentioned it a couple of times. I was really surprised he said it, which is we're going to get this culture right. And when you say that, especially because you've been on the staff for the last 3 seasons, that says something is wrong. Cowboys have been a pretty good team for the last 20 years. Pretty good, right? Not good enough, but pretty good. But he said it. I asked Stephen Jones about it, and it hasn't been bad. What's been missing? Like, what, you've been around it. What was wrong with it?
Yeah, I think there might be a couple of bad apples in the locker room as far as, I don't know. There's a couple of guys, and I'm not going to say names, but there's a couple of guys where whenever they are down, they put everyone else around them down, and it kind of just stirs up issues. I mean, we can come back to Ezekiel Elliott last year. Let's do that.
Okay.
And
yeah, because Zeke's not going to be on the team.
Exactly.
We
don't got to worry about this biting me in the ass. So we look at him showing up late to meetings, him straight up not showing up to meetings sometimes, and it's starting to trickle down to some other guys offensively. Kevontae Turpin was someone that had some issues late in the season last year with showing up to meetings on time and things of the nature. When you have a bad apple, it creates bad apples around them. When you get mold on a piece of bread, that mold starts to spread onto other pieces of bread. Yep. And I think, if anything, that's probably what Schottenheimer was pointing to. I don't think this locker room has a culture issue. I didn't think it had a culture issue under Mike McCarthy. McCarthy did a good job of being a player's coach at the end of the day, but I think there are a couple of guys in the locker room that might need to get a jolt. And, I think Schottenheimer – I think he could be a good guy for that. You look around at some other assistants that they've hired since then, and I know we'll probably dive into it a little bit more. Defensive line coach Aaron Whitecotton, he comes from the New York Jets. That's a guy that's going to require a high standard, and if you don't meet it, then there's going to be a confrontation about it. And so I think having guys like that on the Schottenheimer staff could certainly help fix the little issues that they do have when it comes to culture. Again, I don't think there are any major issues. I don't think this is a culture problem in this locker room, but nothing is perfect. And I think Schottenheimer is just going to get it a little bit closer to perfection.
All right, let's get into something that you kind of briefly tipped on it, and that is the idea of instilling some discipline. There were some questions about that under Mike McCarthy. Nothing egregious, but just some concerns. Last week, Michael Irvin, passionate Dallas Cowboys supporter, member of the Pro Football Hall of Fame, ex-Cowboys great, goes on, I don't know what podcast or whatever, and he goes on a rant about hiring Brian Schottenheimer and an in-house candidate for a team that had a little bit of discipline issues. You're fourth in the league in penalties, and he's got players going to bat for him. Now all of a sudden, and Michael was not critical of Brian. He owned it by saying, I don't even know the guy. But he brought up this issue of you're bringing in this in-house candidate, and now you've got players going to bat for him, and now the coach says at some point during the season, he starts assessing fines. He starts to assess or starts to instill penalties associated with discipline. And Michael Irvin brought this up. The players look at that same coach that they went to bat for and say, wait a minute, now you're going to be like that when we got you the job. And it doesn't mean it's, and Michael's point was, I don't know the man, but I know men. And he makes some good points.
Yeah.
Tell me why that's not going to be an issue here. It may not be, but certainly it's something worth at least touching on.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point too, especially when you consider the player support, like you said, that Schottenheimer did have. But, at the end of the day, Schotty's got to look up and he realizes he's the guy in the room. And I think too, on the other hand, he has players in the locker room that will be on his side if an issue were to ever occur. I mean,
I'm thinking Dak for sure. And maybe Micah, maybe.
And underrated guy, Tyler Smith. Tyler Smith is somebody that is really starting to emerge as a leader in that locker room. He's the team representative for the NFL Players Association, and they voted for him to be that guy this past season. So, I mean, he's a guy that requires a lot too, but I think if an issue were to occur, he would have enough voice and enough backing to be able to handle the issue. Are fines or anything, is that necessary? when you have the fourth most penalties in the NFL, I think that's certainly something you look at. And especially if you see discipline off the field or during the week translating onto the field, then yeah, absolutely. That's when you would have to factor that in. But as long as it's fair and just, it doesn't matter who got who the job. It's about being a professional at the end of the day.
So, Nick, when it comes to that particular concern, the way I see it, and you can tell me if you disagree, it's not a concern, but it's something to sort of keep an eye on.
Yeah, I think so. Well, I wouldn't even necessarily say to keep an eye on, just because I don't have concerns about the culture under Brian Schottenheimer. I don't have the concerns about discipline or having to handle those things. I didn't really have it under McCarthy necessarily. I think there's just a couple of bad apples, but I think every locker room has it.
Yeah. All right, let's move on. Brian Schottenheimer is the new head coach. Mike McCarthy is a guy that he worked for 3 seasons. Before that, it was Jason Garrett for 9+ years. And then obviously there was the Wade Phillips era. There's something about this hire that says to me, we're going to see more of the same. Do you think so?
Yeah, I think it's hard to imagine what change could look like under Brian Schottenheimer. And I tried to write an article after the presser. I think that article came out on Tuesday about okay, look, this is the same exact regime. You're pulling away a big part of the previous regime. How much change can you really expect? And I think we're going to find the answers to that once this staff is complete. And from what we've seen, there is quite a bit of change associated with this staff. I think the offensive scheme is going to look pretty different. I think it's even going to look more different than I expected. And we'll be talking about an offensive coordinator hire probably next week. I assume for that to happen over the course of this weekend. And I think there's going to be more of an emphasis on running the ball. I have an article up on Star Telegram right now explaining why that's the case. And they're putting a lot of draft resources into scouting running backs at the moment. This potential offensive coordinator hire is a guy that has run game knacks coming from the Arizona Cardinals offensive line coach. That's the guy that I expect to be the hire at the end of the day, Clayton Adams. And I think there's a lot of investment being put into, we know Brian Schottenheimer has the West Coast pass concepts. We know what he can bring from that standpoint. How do we marry that with an efficient run game? Whenever you look up at Saquon Barkley and Derrick Henry and all of these running backs that are having mass success for teams and carrying them into the playoffs, I think that's something that this team is emphasizing this offseason, especially when you look at the comments from Stephen Jones. But if we're looking from a big perspective as far as success and playoff success and things like that, can you expect much change? Early on, I don't think so, just because not only would you have a first-time head coach in week 1, you would have a first-time head coach in the postseason whenever that does come, whether that's in the wild card round or the divisional round this year, next year, the year after. Whenever you get deep into the playoffs, you want guys that have been there, done that. And certainly there's not many guys on the roster that have been there, done that. And now you have a head coach who wouldn't have been there, done that either. So I don't think you can expect it early on specifically. But I think this is going to be something that's every week is going to have such a big microscope. I mean, Brian Schottenheimer has a really tough job in 2025 because he's not only having to prove himself right, but he's having to prove Dak right, Jerry Jones, Stephen Jones. He's going to have the biggest microscope of any head coach in the NFL going into 2025.
One of the issues with Dak Prescott, because of his age and now injury history, is can they design something where he can be still? I'm not talking about just an anchor quarterback who just drops back and doesn't move, but clearly his days of getting out of the pocket and running, that's not going to happen much anymore. What can we expect? What can fans expect, Nick, when they watch this offense under Brian Schottenheimer? Now, I know they'll hire a coordinator, but Brian's here to call plays, because if he wasn't calling plays, he was going to leave. So he's here to call plays. What can we expect out of Dak Prescott as a quarterback that we have not seen him be asked to do or maybe do more of than when he's been the quarterback under Jason Garrett, Kellen Moore, or Mike McCarthy?
I don't know if I necessarily have an answer right now for Dak specifically, but offensive schematics wise, Schottenheimer led on a couple of notes in his opening presser, and he mentioned one thing that I think is very notable whenever you factor in the context of Dak Prescott's career, is he said he wants to emphasize cut splits and tempo. Explaining
What's
those.
That mean?
Explain
cut splits.
Cut splits being bunch formations, getting everybody close to the line of scrimmage or close to the ball, so it allows more room on the outside and on the sidelines outside the numbers for guys to run routes. So teams we've seen be really successful in doing this. You can look at the Detroit offense, 100%. What Kingsbury did this past season with the Commanders. You can definitely take a look at that. And then I believe it was the Buccaneers that used more bunch formation than any team in the NFL. And whenever you factor the weapons that they had at receiver, even after Chris Godwin went down for the season, even after Mike Evans had missed 4 or 5 games, they were still finding guys getting open. A random rookie and Jalen McMillan turns into a guy that has back-to-back 100-yard games. I mean, that's an offensive concept that sets guys up for success no matter who it is, because it just allows them so much more freedom. Now, the tempo piece as well, we saw a little bit of tempo under Kellen Moore at times, and I think you might see a little bit of remnants of that, but I'm curious to see what exactly tempo looks like when it's manifested into the run game specifically, because if there's tempo associated with that, then you're also asking your 31, 32-year-old quarterback to not really take any time off on the course of a 12-play drive. So it's going to be interesting whenever you look at it, but I think for Dak specifically, it's tough to tell right now. I know that they are trying to figure out ways to keep Dak as healthy as possible. And if that includes him not scrambling as much going into these next 4 years, if that includes him not being a guy who takes off and tries to pick up first downs with his legs as much, then, that would have to be factored in. But I don't know if I have anything specifically under Schottenheimer that Dak would be changing right now.
Okay, so last thing I'll touch on this, we'll move to the last subject before we go to break. Do they have the personnel to do it? Because I know concepts are great.
Yeah.
X's and O's are great. And it all works on a dry erase board, or it all works on a Microsoft tablet. It does. And then you get out there and you're like, oh, okay, this guy can't do this. He can do that, but he can't do this. Yeah. And I think anybody who watched the season would tell you, especially when it came to the skill guys, specifically receivers and tight ends, it left a lot to be desired after 88. Nick, do they have the skill guys necessary to kind of run those concepts that Brian would want to run?
Yeah, absolutely not right now.
Okay, and, that is telling.
Yeah,
okay.
You look at the running back position, the only running back signed in the 2025 season right now is Deuce Vaughn. So they're going to have to add some names there, multiple names, whether that be bringing Rico Dowdle back, drafting a guy like Ashton Genty or other running backs in the draft. They're going to have to do some serious work this offseason to give Schottenheimer and Dak some weapons.
Okay, last topic before we take a break, and that is Stephen Jones. I'm not sure what he was doing, but at the press conference on Monday, he decided to pull out the air quotes to describe the drought that the Dallas Cowboys have allegedly been in. I have now nicknamed him Stephen Air Quote Jones. Since Washington made the NFC Championship game last week, of which they were promptly blown out of the city of Philadelphia.
Made the NFC Championship game.
That's good. I need to do this more.
Yeah, that's pretty good. It's pretty good.
Every team, it is. Air quotes are phenomenal. Every team in the NFC has been to the conference championship game more recently than the Cowboys. Before Washington made it, the two teams that were in a dead heat were Washington, which had last been in the NFC Championship game, was in 1991, and then Dallas, obviously, was in 1996. So the Cowboys are at the bottom. Now, however, I do want to say this. I've been guilty of being called a pessimist. I call myself a closet optimist. If you take that same chart and flip it, then they're in first place. So, it all depends on perspective. In terms of this drought thing, and he got hammered for it, and I'm going to kill him for it, just have fun with it. Do they not see that? And I'm asking you to speak for Steven and Jerry and everybody else. Do you think they don't see that this is a drought? And now they've had good teams, and they've had the 6 most wins since 2015 or whatever it is, and they've only had 4 or 5 losing seasons since 2003. There are legitimate superlatives these last 20 seasons that has not included a trip to the NFC Championship game. Do you think they don't see it as a drought?
How it was communicated to me afterward from the team was that the air quote what he was using was saying that it's being talked about so much. The drought that everyone's talking about, like how we do in headlines, where it's like, Brian Schottenheimer says we are going to run the ball or whatever. It's that's what he was alluding to. I don't buy it though. That's just me. I think they
That's
know.
such a crappy explanation.
I was like, okay, but
Okay,
they know.
sure, fine.
They
Santa's
know.
real.
I will put it in a whole holistic view. They know
It's a
exactly
good
what
one. It's
they're up
good
against.
synergy. All right, good.
They know exactly what they're up against. They know exactly what this drought is. They're very aware of it, and it's.
Let me ask you this. A player told me this. I'm going to cut you off.
You're good. You're good.
Okay. I talked to a former player, guy who played there for a long time, and his point was, I don't think it really bothers him that much. The brain trust of the Cowboys, the Joneses, and I like Jerry a lot. I like Steven a lot. Charlotte. This isn't a matter of that, and as a former player, the former player was pretty convincing, and I don't. I think it does bother them when they lose. Does it really bother them? And I think one of the challenges is when you are that rich and you have that much wealth and your quality of life and everybody around you is such, and you have the security that comes with it in your job. Because as Jerry said, he bought an occupation. He's not going to fire himself. He's not going to fire Steven. He's not going to fire Charlotte, etc. If you're a Jones, you have a job. Okay. How much can it really bother you? Do you think it really bothers them?
I think it does. And I think that is one part that I think fans get wrong, is that it's like, oh, all Jerry cares about is money. He doesn't care about winning. This is why he does this, that, and third. I don't think that's the case. I just don't think he knows how to win. I don't think it's a lack of care. I think it's a lack of knowledge when it comes to being a GM in the NFL, because there's only one GM in American sports that has not gotten to a conference championship and kept a job for 30 years. So I think I don't think there's a lack of desire to win in that building. I felt that when I worked there, and I still feel that now. And especially with Jerry Jones, where his age is, he started to like leak out comments here and there about, he knows he doesn't have a lot of time left. Yeah. That family wants to get him one more before it's over with. I can promise.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I've told people that I think he cares tremendously. And I remember a former coach, a guy who really liked him. He doesn't work for the team anymore, and the guy I knew pretty well. And he said he loved him. He was great. The hell of a businessman. He said, I just don't think he knows how to run a football team. And he didn't say it critically. He was saying it like water is wet. Yeah. But I do think there is one. Now, listen, I want to be clear about this. Jerry loves making money. Mm-hmm. That is a priority for him. And super rich people, that is a priority for them. That they wake up thinking about how do I make more money. And I think Jerry, and it's allowed him to be incredibly wealthy. So but both of them are true. He really wants to win. I think you're right. I don't think he necessarily knows how to. And they've got 20 plus years of evidence to suggest that your assessment, my assessment, and God knows how many other critics are right. All right. We got more to talk about here on Cowboys Overtime. But first, a word from our friends at Window Nation.
Window Nation, the star of window replacement and proud partner of the Dallas Cowboys, can help you fill the house this season with savings. Buy 2 windows, get 2 free, and make no interest payments for 60 months, 5 full years. Fill your house for a customized authentic Dallas Cowboys jersey while supplies last. You could even help fill the Cowboys house and win tickets to a game. Visit windownation.com/Cowboys now for details. Call 866-95-NATION. Window Nation, proud partner of the Dallas Cowboys.
Thank you very much, Window Nation. I was kidding about the friends part. You are our friends because you make this episode of Cowboys Overtime and every other one possible here on StarTelegram.com. I'm Mac Engel. He's Nick Harris. All right, Nick, we've got a couple more things before we wrap this up. There are obviously a lot of other changes that go along with when you have a head coach change, as the Cowboys have. There's a big one coming down the road, and that is a defensive coordinator, Mike Zimmer. It looks like he will retire. That's what he told Ed Werder of WFAA, longtime former Cowboys assistant, former NFL head coach of the Minnesota Vikings. He came back for one season, did okay, but it looks like Brian Schottenheimer and the Cowboys want to move on to a different candidate, namely former Dallas Cowboys defensive coordinator, Matt Eberflus. This is a hire I really like. Jason Garrett, it's one of the weird things and very telling things about the Jason Garrett tenure. It lasted 9+ seasons, and he did not have much of a coaching tree. Unlike some other NFL head coaches, when they stay in a place that long, they have other coaches all over the place. Jason really didn't produce that, unlike, let's say, a Bill Parcells timeline here, who, guys keeps, whether you played or you coached here, they're still getting jobs. One of Jason's I think it's just one. One of his former assistants went on to be a head coach elsewhere, and that's Matt Eberflus. Well, he's now going to be the defensive coordinator for the Cowboys. I really like this hire. I'm dying to know your thoughts about this one. What do you think about him as a DC?
I think it's an interesting one for a couple.
Ooh, interesting is not good.
This is a good interesting. I think this
Nick,
is good.
how was that dinner? It was interesting. It was interesting.
Yeah, it was an interesting sauce on the. I hadn't tasted that before.
Was it good? No, it's interesting.
The reason I say interesting.
Okay, go ahead.
Is because what he has specialized in his time as a coordinator and now, or I say now, but when he was a head coach in Chicago, is zone scheme in the secondary. Very talented players in the secondary, and kind of an underwhelming approach to his defensive front, except for specifically the under tackle, the 3 technique position, which if you're looking at the Dallas Cowboys, that's the Osa Odighizuwa of the defensive line. Other than that, he kind of underwhelmed when it came to the defensive front, the pass rush unit. But you look at guys in the secondary like a Jalen Johnson, and he got a little bit more than expected out of Kevin Byard, and they're starting to put some real great pieces together in the secondary in Chicago, and that's a credit to Matt Eberflus. The zone scheme part is interesting because Dan Quinn ran more man coverage than any team in the NFL 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. And then you bring in Mike Zimmer, and he was trying to keep a lot of that the same going in. And I think they finished around like 10 to 12 in man coverage rate. This team is now going to flip into being a top 3 to top 5 zone scheme, a type of defense. And so that's going to be really different for guys like Deron Bland, who has only played under a majority man coverage scheme in his career. Trayvon Diggs in the same case. You could look at the safety group. I think this is going to benefit a guy like Malik Hooker a little bit more, specifically when you factor in that his best years in the NFL came when he was playing under Matt Eberflus in Indianapolis with him as defensive coordinator. Now the defensive front, this is where it's going to get interesting. This is the interesting part to me, is that they bring in a guy, Aaron Whitecotton, defensive line coach for the New York Jets, who has done a phenomenal job in getting the most out of what he has on his defensive line. Will McDonald has 10.5 sacks this last year. Quinnen Williams is one of the best pass rushing interior defensive linemen in the NFL, and that's a credit to him. You look at Brian Huff, who got signed by the Eagles this past offseason and hasn't done anything since he's been in Philadelphia. When he was with the Jets, he got double-digit sacks last 2 seasons ago. This is a guy who knows how to get the most out of his guys in the pass rush department. This is kind of being explained to me as a situation whereas on the Dan Quinn staff, his number 2 was Al Harris. You could look at the same case on Mike Zimmer's staff, how Paul Gunther was kind of his number 2. I think in this case, this is going to be Aaron Whitecotton being the number 2 as far as, okay, hey, the defensive coordinator, he specializes in this area, which in Eberflus's case, zone scheme secondary. I'm going to specialize in this area, which in this case is Aaron Whitecotton being able to get the most out of the defensive front, getting after the quarterback, figuring out different pass rush plans. I think this is where it's going to be maximized in that end. This is kind of be a co-DC situation in that sense. But overall, I think this Eberflus hire was the right one. I'm just curious to see how it comes together. There's going to be a lot of questions at training camp about it.
We saw this season the difference Micah Parsons made when he was playing and not playing. When he suffered that sprained ankle against the Giants and then he was out for the next few weeks, the difference was noticeable, especially when he came back. I mean, he just changed things almost immediately. Yeah. And he's the presence of a player that you recognize right off the bat. You're like, oh my God, this guy's making a difference. Yeah. Even on plays that he's not necessarily making, you can see the accountability that offenses have to dedicate towards that guy. He's played under different coordinators now since he's been here. He loved Dan Quinn. You could see why he would appeal, like Dan would appeal to him. Not that he didn't like Zimmer, but how would you expect? And I have one more question about this hire, the Eberflus hire, before we move on. But how can you expect, Nick, this hire will impact a player of the caliber of Micah Parsons?
Yeah, I think when a DC hire is being factored in, and I heard this last offseason when they were looking for a DC, is the first question in the interview has to be, okay, what are you going to do with Micah Parsons? Because he's the chess piece. He's the guy you have to get the most out of for the all 11 to succeed. There's a plan for Micah Parsons or else Matt Eberflus would not be the DC. I'm curious, though, to see how that marries with the concepts of Aaron Whitecotton and how that kind of translates from his time in New York. It's going to be a fun training camp diving into the intricacies of that.
Well, so there's one thing about, you mentioned it. I'm glad you mentioned it because I had not thought about this specifically, because I remember when I was covering the team more frequently, Rod Marinelli, when he was the defensive coordinator, He was a big 3 technique guy. And I know we're getting into the weeds too football here, but he was a big 3 technique guy. And he thrived in it when he was in Tampa, when he had Warren Sapp. Now, Warren Sapp is a Hall of Fame player, and great players make great coaches. And that relationship works both ways. To me, if you can find a player who can make a difference at that position, boy, does it make a difference.
Yeah.
I mean, if you can find a guy who can get upfield from that spot and really wreak havoc up the middle and cause problems for multiple players on an offensive line and into the backfield potentially for a running back, you have really screwed up what they want to do. And they're really hard to find. And I'm sure he's plugged in a bunch of guys and this is going to work. And because they're tough to find. This is not like finding an edge rusher. And that finding an edge rusher to me is easier to find in developing a good 3 technique on the middle. But if you can, that opens up a lot of possibilities for different spots. Do you think his arrival changes the way the Cowboys will approach free agency in Osa?
I believe so, because there was a thought at the end of the season from talking to people that the Cowboys were not going to be able to afford Osa Odighizuwa.
Right.
Jory Epstein of Yahoo Sports reported over the weekend after talking with Stephen Jones in Mobile that Osa Odighizuwa was going to be a priority for them going into free agency. I asked somebody, they confirmed that. Like, yes, we would love to get Osa back. And so the tune has changed in that sense, because, talking to guys right after the end of the season, it was like, we might need a draft there. I don't think we can afford him. Now it's like, he's a priority. We want him. So it's, I wonder how that manifests here in a few weeks, whenever free agency opens. PFF ranked him as the number 10 overall free agent in the entire NFL going into the cycle, which surprised me. That was the highest ranked Dallas Cowboy that they had. It is going to factor in money, which I wonder if the money is going to be big enough to franchise tag him. And the Cowboys haven't used a franchise tag in a few years. I believe Dalton Schultz was the last one. Mm-hmm. You might have a better memory than I do there.
That was it. It was Dalton.
Dak, but was it Dak and then Dalton Schultz?
Yeah, it's funny. I forgot they did that to Dak, because they've done this a few times. They did it with Anthony Spencer in consecutive years.
Yep.
And that was a little weird, but they did it with him. And ultimately, that was one of those things where it kind of worked out for the player, because he got consecutive franchise tags. And, players hate that tag for obvious reasons, but it's a lot of upfront money. And I think they threatened it on Dez Bryant, but they never did use it on Dez. Obviously the Dak thing. And then, it was Dalton Schultz. And I'm trying, is there anybody else?
Here we go. Here, I found it. So Dez 2015.
They did use it on Dez?
They did. DeMarcus Lawrence in 2018. DeMarcus Lawrence in 2019. Dak in 2020. Dak again in 2021. Dalton Schultz in 2022. And then I forgot that they did use it on Tony Pollard in 2023. I had forgotten about that. So they did
Dak
not use
play on it. Nick, they put the tag on him, but I thought they got an extension done before the season started.
That's
so
correct.
He didn't play on it necessarily.
Yeah. So in 2020, he technically played on it, but then hurt his leg. 21, they applied the tag, and then they ended up signing the extension before the season started. That is correct. But to get back to the point of 25, I think Osa Odighizuwa is a very high potential there. And if you're looking forward to 26, I think Brandon Aubrey would be one to look at. I'd be surprised if they don't use the tag in at least one of these next 2 years. But Osa, I wonder if his money becomes that valuable, where it's like, okay, hey, we have to pay this guy. And basically what the franchise tag is, to people that don't know, is you take the top 5 annual value of all the top 5 contracts at that position in the NFL. So you look at all defensive tackles in the NFL. That includes guys like that would be Chris Jones. That would be Cameron Hayward, I believe, is in that department. There's a couple other guys I'm blanking off the top of my head right now. But you take the average annual value of all those guys put together, and that's the franchise tag that you pay him for one season. And is Osa Odighizuwa worth top 5 defensive tackle money? I don't think so, but if you're trying to keep him around, maybe. And so that's
the problem with it. But
he's only put together one 17-game season, and it was this last year. And that's the only time you can really look at it and be like, okay, hey, that was a complete effort start to finish. Are you comfortable paying that much money for a guy who's only had one complete season? I don't know. But I think in this scheme,
somebody's going to.
It could be interesting. Somebody's going to give him stupid money. The same with Rico Dowdle. I don't know if he's going to get stupid money, but a defensive tackle,
who
Yeah.
put together a good season. We saw it last time. So we see it time and again. Randy Gregory got paid, on and on and on. We see it all the time. The hell, the Cowboys did it before they decided to say, "Yeah, we're not doing this anymore." We see it all the time. And when they hit, you're like, "Oh my gosh, why isn't your team doing it?" And when they miss, you're like, "Whew, okay, certainly glad they didn't do that with Randy Gregory." And we see it both ways. There are other there are other changes to the team, to the staff. Can you give us a quick rundown of what other changes that they've announced so far we should expect coming to position coaches?
Yeah, I'll actually start with the one consistency is they did bring back tight ends coach Lunda Wells, which was a big addition back to the staff for these guys. They wanted to bring him back. He was courted by the Chicago Bears. He ends up sticking around. Looking at the other guys that they have brought in, we already talked about Aaron Whitecotton, the defensive line coach, being brought in. I think that's a very valued addition. Dave Borgonzi is the linebackers coach, which he was a former assistant, just kind of a consultant around the team in the late 2010s. I think it was like 2017 to 2019. And his brother is actually the general manager for the Tennessee Titans. So there's some lineage there as well. And then Andre Curtis is being brought in as a defensive passing game coordinator, played a lot in the league. He comes from Denver. I think that's going to be an interesting addition, just kind of paired with Eberflus's mind. I expect some more hires to happen over the weekend. Like I mentioned, I think OC is heavily trending towards Clayton Adams, who is the offensive line coach for the Arizona Cardinals. He will probably end up making his own offensive staff hires with the combination of Schottenheimer. So that's probably why you haven't seen a whole lot of offensive hires just yet. But they need to hire a receivers coach, an O-line coach, obviously an offensive coordinator, running backs coach, quarterbacks coach. On the defensive side, they need a linebackers coach and a safeties coach. And then it kind of depends on what they want to do as far as corners or defensive backs, how they want to play that. But there's still quite a bit to fill out on this staff.
Well, the other one that it's not going to be a change. It was a change that I thought was going to happen because his contract expired, and that is the director of player personnel, Will McClay, is coming back. Yeah. That's a significant move for the Cowboys. He's had a lot of success in player acquisition and with an eye on talent. He's a guy's a workaholic. I thought with his contract expiring that this would be the go-around where he becomes a general manager of a different NFL franchise. Didn't happen. He signed a 5-year deal. I think it's a terrific hire and a terrific keep for the Cowboys. What do you think is preventing him from becoming an NFL general manager on another franchise? Or do you even think he wants to do it? He's just happy here.
Yes, to your last question. He wants to be in Dallas, and he's expressed many times that, hey, this is where I've been for the last 25 years. And he mentioned that again after signing this extension. He's like, I want to win a Super Bowl, and I want to win it with these people that are here. I mean, he's really close with the Jones family. Him and Stephen Jones are pretty tight. Him and Jerry are pretty tight. He wants to be able to get it done in this building. Now, as far as GM potential openings. I mean, last cycle he was asked twice for an interview and he declined both interviews. And so it gets to a point where, teams will start back channeling like, hey, is Will, this is how this stuff works. And I'm not saying this is what happened with Will McClay. No, you're right. They'll reach out to the agent. Hey, do you think Will would be interested? Nah, probably not. All right, thanks. Hang up. So who's to say that didn't happen a couple times this cycle? Who knows? But he has not shown an interest in leaving in a while. So I think he's firmly comfortable where he's at.
All right, last topic we'll talk about here on Cowboys Overtime before we move on and wrap it up. And that is a very, very quick preview of the Super Bowl where Nick is going. It is in New Orleans. Please be safe. Kansas City versus Philadelphia, Part 2, the sequel, the game that nobody wanted. It is on February 9th. Kansas City is a 1.5-point favorite. All right, my view of dynasties and all that stuff has totally evolved over the years. I know there are a lot of people complaining that the Chiefs now have reached boring status, that nobody wants to see Kansas City and Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce and Andy Reid and that whole crew back in the Super Bowl again.
Yeah.
Where do you sit on that pendulum?
I'm a little biased. I'm going to start right there because I grew up 10 minutes away from Patrick Mahomes in East Texas.
Oh, did you? I didn't. Oh, that's right. Were you there in White House? Did you see him playing at White House?
So I grew up in Chapel Hill, and White House is the direct rival of Chapel Hill. Okay. So much so that when my dad was in high school, White House came to our high school and burned a W on the field the day before the game. Like burned it, legitimately burned a W on the turf, and they had to play with that W on the field. It's a legit rivalry. But whenever Patrick Mahomes was coming up, I mean, I saw him play baseball at 12 years old. I've seen him play flag football when he was like 10. I mean, I've seen this guy like grow up, so I've always rooted for his success. Had it been, like, I don't know, Jalen Hurts being that guy, I'd probably be like, yeah, let's get these Chiefs out of here. But I'm a Mahomes guy. What can I say?
You know what? The NFL is one of those entities that doesn't really need, they don't need really much of anything. The game sells itself to the point where it can literally do whatever it wants, and the stadiums are going to be sold and TV ratings are going to be great. I am of the belief, having grown up in the 80s when the Lakers were in the dynasty, the 49ers were in a dynasty, the Chicago Bulls became a dynasty, the Boston Celtics became a dynasty, and a few other franchises. Dynasty franchises are great for sports because they do create an interest just to see if will they be beaten. Can somebody beat them? Like that Bills Chiefs game the other day was a great game.
Yeah,
and it is great theater to see. Oh my gosh, are they going to get them? Because I remember I used to watch those Bulls teams, whether it was the Pacers coming close or the Trailblazers or whomever else, the Jazz in back-to-back finals. Are they going to get them? Are they going to get them? And they just didn't. And whatever you want to say, it's great theater. Certainly watching the San Antonio Spurs with Tim Duncan, that was amazing. And the Patriots forever and ever. What an astounding dynasty that they built in a salary cap era. So I'll ask you this. Is this dynasty, which it is a dynasty now, they're going for a three-peat, never been done before. Is this dynasty now as impressive as what the Patriots built under Belichick and Brady?
That one's tough just because they got 6 Super Bowls out of it together.
Yeah, they're not there yet. Yeah,
that would take some serious longevity. Ask me in about 5 years, and I think we'll be trending towards that, trajectory, because there was a stat that ESPN, or a graphic that ESPN had made right after the AFC Championship, and it was comparing Brady's first 7 seasons and Mahomes' first 7 seasons when it came to like Super Bowl appearances, wins, Super Bowl MVPs, and they're almost identical. So I mean, he's on the trajectory. It's just about sustaining it. The sustainability of it is what's so hard, and I think that's why people put Tom Brady in such an echelon that no other player could potentially reach, just because, I mean, what Mahomes has done already is Hall of Fame worthy. I mean, he's going to be a first ballot guy. No matter, he could end his career tomorrow and it's done. But he would need to stack a complete 7 years right after this 7-year run that is almost better to get to where Brady is. So he's on his way, but he's got a long way to go.
No, you're right. He's about halfway there, because I think sometimes, and I don't know if you do this or not with players, you go down the rabbit hole on baseballreference.com or pro basketball reference, and you see certain careers and you just keep scrolling. And with Brady, it's astounding what and I do understand the rules changed. There are certain hits that Brady took early in his career that would have been a penalty, or hell, even ejection in the latter part of his career. And Mahomes hasn't had to go through that, and the game's changed. It's just in that part of it for quarterbacks is different, because they're paying quarterbacks so much money now. They don't want them to get hurt, obviously. But I think you're right. Obviously, what Kansas City's done and is doing is amazing. They ain't where New England is yet. You got about another 5 to 7 years of doing the exact same thing, and then we can talk. All right, we have talked a lot. It's been fun as always. Nick, have a great trip in New Orleans. Be safe, please. And get some lobster, or get some oysters. Are you an oyster guy?
Oh, am I? I just had the best oysters of my life in Mobile, Alabama, by the way. Felix's. If you're ever in Mobile, Felix's.
Absolutely.
It was incredible.
So do you believe in that whole oysters are only good in months that end in R?
I've never heard that.
You've never heard that?
I think they're good on days that end in Y.
Amen, brother. All right. Thank you very much, Window Nation. Nick, have a great trip. For all of your Cowboys coverage needs, be sure to check us out on StarTelegram.com. Thank you, Window Nation, again. We'll see you next week.